To introduce myself, my name is Giulia Zigo. I work in GSK Vaccine. I'm based in Italy. It's a pleasure for me. It's the first time at this workshop, and also to be a chair with Kit for this session. And we have 3 talks. The first 2 will be here in presence. The third one will be online. And we can start with the first talk. Our speakers comes from the Finnish Medicine Regulatory Agency, the Tommi Nurminen and Kallio Antero Kallio, sorry. Sorry. Tommi has a master degree in statistics at the University of Turku in Finland, and has nearly 20 years of experience in pharma and CRO companies. And since 2021, Tommi worked for Fimea as a biostat, and the task of Tommi includes mainly assessment of marketing authorization application and variation, scientific advice, and assessment of clinical trial application. Also, now Antero Kallio has also a master's degree and also a PhD in clinical pharmacology at the same University of Turku in Finland. He has 30 years of experience in pharma and biotech companies. So since 2018, Kallio works as a senior medical officer at the Finnish Regulatory Agency, Fimea, where the main tasks are clinical assessment of marketing authorization application variation, as well as scientific advice at both at national and central EMA level. Thanks to both. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so you'll see the topic of our talk there in front of you. Indeed, we are going to talk about scientific advice given by Scientific Advice Working Party. And I'll say already, we are going to pronounce Scientific Advice Working Party as SOAP. From the perspective of people who work in national medicines agencies, indeed, I'm a biostatistician. Antero, where are you there?
I'm here.
So you are a clinical assessor. So we hopefully cover the perspective of both of us in some ways or the other. Obviously, we are going to present not only some facts, but also some controversial views, which are our own.
All right. So starting on from what types of advice are available, let's say like in an increasing level of formality. First of all, you can seek national advice. In Finland, we have 2 levels. A very informal level mostly for early stage drug developers, sort of a very informal discussion meetings, and then a more semi-formal national advice process where written material is submitted in advance and sort of akin to the sort of more central levels of advice. There is currently a pilot process going on in Europe where our German colleagues are coordinating a process called simultaneous national scientific advice, where you can seek simultaneous advice from 2 or more member states through their respective competent authorities. What we are focusing on today is the EMA-coordinated centralized scientific advice, mostly sort of the, let's say, like the pure scientific advice where you don't involve the joint procedures that will be subject to a separate discussion. There is also a possibility to obtain parallel advice with the US FDA. We are not going to touch on that. Protocol assistance is a separate process that is available for orphan medicine developers. And then these qualification opinions, if you want to discuss a novel endpoint that you have developed or some new technology, that is a process that you can also utilize there. As opposed to these other procedures that are all confidential between the regulator and the respective applicant, these qualification opinions are sort of available also on a public basis. So you can actually check on the EMA website what kind of qualification opinions have been issued for various types of novel technologies.
Okay, a few words about who gives the scientific advice. So in the core is this SOP. It's a standing working party of Committee for Human Medicinal Products, also known as CHMP. And its task is to give scientific advice to companies. It has 36 members. There are at least, 3 members from 3 committees, which are listed here: Pediatric Committee for Advanced Therapies and the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products. SOP is ensured to have also expertise from non-clinical safety, pharmacokinetics, methodology and statistics, and certain therapeutic fields, some of which are mentioned in the regulation, but some of which there is just this experience that we get a lot of requests from. Okay, name dropping is it always gives a good impression, so I'm going to list quite a few. I will make a great impression by dropping so many names to you, but this is indeed the list of all the SOP members taken from EMA's website, and I will highlight it with bold and a special color some members who have a special interest in biostatistics. Actually, if you don't mind, please raise your hands if you see your name there. Elina is there, member of
Lucas is there.
Lucas is there, and we have some people online, hopefully. Now, something I want to note here is that indeed these members are sourced from national medicines agencies, so they are not employees of EMA. Am I correct? Maybe there's some 1 or 2, but to my knowledge, everyone is sourced from national agencies. Okay, there's the scientific advice working party having its meeting. So what does the process look like? In a nutshell, it looks like this. Scientific advice working party gets a request for scientific advice via EMA's website. Then people will sit and wait for 100 days. And then EMA will organize a letter back to the applicant of scientific advice, i.e. the sponsor of planned studies. And yeah, that's how it works. So obviously it's not ideal for getting very quick feedback. You cannot just take the phone and call and ask, or you can try, but that's not the process we are talking about here. So it's something you want to probably plan early in advance. So engage in time, that's what people often say in this context. These 100 days is not even true if a discussion meeting will be organized. So a kind of face-to-face meeting with the company. So that certainly will extend the timeline.
So if you look at the black box in a little more detail, the process chart is there for the engineer-minded of you. Briefly, it goes so that there are 2 of these SOP members who are selected as coordinators for each of these processes. They compile within their national agency an assessment team, which can be sort of multidisciplinary depending on the nature of the questions, and also sometimes even a multinational team is deployed if resources are scarce. These 2 teams independently prepare their first reports, which are then discussed in a meeting, or critical topics are addressed, and differing views are sort of, let's say, tried to be harmonized. If all goes well, there are no differing views or major discussion items. These are then combined into a joint report then that reflects the, let's say, the sum of these 2 reports. Sometimes if there are big differences, you can be invited into a discussion meeting where these discrepancies are addressed, or differing views between the sponsor and the regulators. That affects the timeline such that if you are involved in a discussion meeting or an extra loop, then that prolongs the timeline somewhat. The joint report is peer-reviewed by a third SOAP member, and then the CHMP finally adopts what is called the final advice letter, and that is the written output of what you obtain from this process. There's a few sort of practical points that I would like to remind you of. So the assessors involved in the scientific advice process are not necessarily, and they may be not even usually, the same assessors as who will be performing subsequent CTA clinical trial application assessment or marketing authorization application assessment. So, and furthermore, the scientific advice is not binding on the CTA or MAA assessors. So, so there is, let's say, like a little bit of a discontinuity as compared to, for example, in the US, where the FDA sort of reviews your program from start to the end, basically. And so, of course, the scientific advice is considered during subsequent assessment, but the people involved may be different and usually are different. So, for example, I do scientific advice, I don't do clinical trial applications. So we have a separate physician team doing clinical trial applications exclusively. As I said, it is definitely considered, but it is not binding. Disagreements sometimes occur. I think they are, in my experience, relatively unusual, but sometimes it occurs. And there, of course, if you are deviating from the advice, good justification is expected in a subsequent assessment of an application, for example. Acceptability of data into an SMPC is a question that you will never get an answer to in scientific advice. This is a question that we see almost always, and the default answer is it's a matter of assessment at the time of the application. So spare yourselves and spare us from that question.
Okay, so a few words about how statisticians are involved in this process. So as already highlighted, there are some statisticians who are members of the SOAP, and they may be appointed to coordinators of each of these processes, of course, obviously, as anyone else, as any other member of the SOAP. When it comes to writing the first reports, at Fimea at least, we have a practice that a statistician is always involved by default when there are clinical questions in that scientific advice procedure. So we are then involved in preparation of the first report. That might, of course, be collaborating with the clinical assessor, but sometimes they can be quite technical also, these statistical questions, and then we might have to work more independently. We also have a so-called bingo process, a routine going on all the time. So now imagine there are like dozens of scientific advice requests that are being covered on a monthly basis. So the statistician members of the scientific advice working party it's not possible for them to read and familiarize themselves with each and every process in detail. So we have this bingo process where a third biostatistician reviews the first reports, compares them, highlights anything that might be relevant for the scientific advice the SOAP members who are biostatisticians to help them out. But of course, by doing this, we also see what other people have done, how they're advised, and we learn from that and hopefully gain consistency over time. Now, obviously, biostatistician SOAP members represent their discipline in those meetings and discussions. Okay, so just some personal reflections on what is it like to work on a single scientific advice procedure. So now the fact is that there's, of course, always limited time and sometimes limited experience and knowledge of the specific disease or therapeutic area that is concerned. Luckily, this is hopefully never true when it comes to clinical understanding. So, so we have people who are specialized. So they should probably not accept to be coordinators to a disease where they have no prior understanding. Anyway, there are of course preconditions, as I call them, to take into account. Most importantly, there are guidelines from EMA, of course, ICH guidelines, which I didn't mention there. But of course, we try to also follow what the other regulators might have written about, you know, the relevant guidelines, for example, from the FDA. Now I've listed different points of view that may be considered and ideally are considered without going through all of them. Of course, there's some scientific judgment combined with personal views or opinions. So, for example, we often see responder analysis being proposed. Perhaps I would have the tendency to say, oh, do you really have to do this? But okay, then it's a judgment call whether it's a good idea to bring it up. Sometimes it may not be. Okay, of course, by experience, one may learn to anticipate how things and suggestions will be perceived by the SOP and eventually the committee. So that might be taken into account ideally. Also, as Antero also already mentioned, at FIMEA, biostatisticians who give scientific advice are the same who also are involved in the assessment of clinical trial applications. So by seeing how things evolve there, we might also try to take into account the clinical trial application phase. But of course, this is not different from the sponsor perspective. Yeah, so in my view, giving or being involved in scientific advice is more difficult than assessing the data, because here you have to try and imagine how the data will look like, and then what kind of evidence it will bring, what kind of statement can be made based on that, and the whole process. But again, this doesn't differ from the sponsor perspective. The same challenges are present there. But anyway, I think it's difficult. It's fair to say so. Okay, it looks very easy when these guys do it. Now, Antero will say a few words about how it maybe can be made easier.
Yeah. So of course, to point out that you know, the applicant and SOP have a common interest is to try to get the best possible advice and help you, you know, develop a program that would then ultimately meet regulatory expectations. So how do you do that? I think on a practical level, a good advice briefing package will explain how your particular protocol fits into your overall development strategy. So we appreciate understanding, you know, what you are trying to accomplish with a specific protocol and how that might sort of, you know, help you ultimately develop your whole dossier. And try to explain not only what will be done on a very technical level, give us some background why you are doing this and what is the justification for, or how you are justifying to yourself that you are what you are, or why you are doing certain things. The FDA told you so. That's an understandable reason, and I think in many circumstances, and we see that a lot happening. But you know, if we subsequently have a different view, it would be helpful for us to understand why the FDA said, you know, that you should do so. If you are referencing to preconditions such as guidelines, you know, previous programs that have done similar things than you are proposing to do, help us with providing references to those preconditions. And if you are deviating from a guideline, I think that would be particularly helpful to get some kind of justification why you are proposing to do that from the outset, so that it doesn't come as a surprise, and it will save you a lot of sort of discussion and maybe eventual complexity afterwards if we can sort of have that discussion at that stage rather than reading a justification for a deviation at the marketing authorization assessment stage.
A couple of examples, very abstract example, but anyway, so a typical, actually I should say that at Fimea we do quite a lot of oncological advice procedures. So what we see often is that a plan for late stage oncological trial includes a description of interim analysis plan, and it usually explains very clearly the expected number of enrolled patients at the time of interim analysis, how much follow-up time would be collected by then, and obviously the required number of endpoint events that triggers the interim analysis. And of course, there's also detailed treatment of type 1 error control. Now, too often, in my experience, we are left trying to understand why is this interim analysis proposed? Why would it be done then? What will be done or claimed based on the results? So I think it would be great if you are more transparent about how you would then take things forward from there. And from the study conduct perspective, I'm often left wondering, what does stopping the study mean? Is it just like inferential stopping, or will the physicians and everyone become unblinded at that time point? Will the whole study actually be closed right there and then? I don't know, but those are details that would help us rather than make us. I mean, currently we are just speculating about what they might mean with this stopping. Okay, another example. Now, a lot of text. So if you don't mind, I'll give you a minute to read it. Now read, the clock is ticking. I said a minute. Okay, we can cut it short. What an awkward moment that was. Anyway, so this is a very typical kind of statistical question that we faced, and it's actually a real case, but I've just anonymized it by changing hopefully as many details as necessary to meet that purpose. So I'm not going to repeat everything you just read. From my perspective, I'm just going to make a few remarks. So first of all, I think it's quite clear proposal what their plan is. I think it's nice that they highlight that, yeah, we are actually proposing a hypothetical estimate at least to a large extent. At least that word is specifically used, which is helpful. Now, there were no other details. So what is missing, in my opinion, is a good justification of why a hypothetical estimate with respect to these two intercurrent events, change in background medication and what was the other one? Missing the study, discontinuing the study treatment. Why the hypothetical approach or strategy is the one to go forward to their primary analysis. So, oops, sorry, I'll go back. Yeah, I think that would be something that would really help this case to have this justification. Before we continue that, content thing, so just one remark about the question. So I think it's interesting, this point, that estimand, the key point associated with study objective, is presented as a sub-bullet of statistical methodology section. So it's not necessarily the right place to estimand discussion, but this is what we see often, and we'll maybe, if the time allows, we'll get back to this. Someone may have paid attention to this statement that the population level summary is the difference in change from baseline. I think just the word mean is missing there, but okay, that's not relevant. But in case you got distracted, I also did, so you're not alone. Okay, so you might be interested in knowing what kind of advice was given in response to this advice request. This wasn't my process, so I didn't write the answer. But anyway, the advice that was given was in a nutshell this: treatment discontinuation in the current event will occur in practice. So what's relevant is the outcome regardless of that. Also, changes in background medication happens in practice, and the outcome regardless of that is relevant. So my conclusion would be that in absence of good justification for the hypothetical approach, it didn't fly, it wasn't endorsed, but maybe it could have been endorsed and supported by the SOP with a good justification. Okay, so time is flying, so just very quickly, a few observations from my perspective of how estimands are being currently discussed. I think it's fair to say, and of course in discussions with people, they seem to be sharing the same feeling that the estimand framework has not become the kind of common playground for statisticians and clinicians. The third bullet point, the word seems to scare many clinical assessors, and it's by default, when they see the word estimand, they're like, Tommy, here's a question for you.
It's in the statistical section, so,
Yeah. Exactly. So I think that example, which was a real example, really highlights that it's not really positioned well. It's not framed as a kind of clinical or multidisciplinary question. And maybe the second bullet point is worth highlighting. So I think estimands are indeed presented as kind of stepwise algorithms. We will do this, if that, and blah, 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 but there's not like trying to really pronounce it well. So we certainly also appreciate when someone tries to describe the estimand in a natural language, although we know that it's very difficult and the sentences are like this. Oh, do I still need to continue? Okay, so do we still have time? Or okay, so we skip that slide.
Let's just very briefly touch on a few situations where you might want to think twice before you are seeking scientific advice. So as Tommy mentioned, CTA and I mentioned, CTA applications are often reviewed by different people. So if you are deviating from the advice, if you have the advice at hand, the CTA assessors will be reading that. And if you are deviating from the advice, it might make your CTA process a little bit more complicated with the quite constrained timelines in the current process. Also, if you know beforehand that you are not going to follow the advice, or if you are seeking just acceptance of something that you have already done, I think it's not a good idea to engage in scientific advice for that purpose. So you should really engage in time to have a substantive discussion. So thank you for that. I hope that gives you sort of like a, let's say, like a hands-on, grassroots understanding of what we are doing in scientific advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we can go for the second presentation, keep the discussion at the end of the session. The second talk, the speaker is David Wright. So David Wright, since 2016, has been head of statistical innovation at AstraZeneca. Before, he was a statistical assessor at the MHRA for 16 years. David chaired the Biostat Working Party at the EMA and the MHRA Scientific Advice Review Committee from 2011 to 2016.
Good morning. Great to be here to talk about scientific advice, one of my favorite subjects. So I'm going to give you some more practical tips, but I was delighted that the first speakers went through all the machinery of what scientific advice is like in Europe, and very similar to when I was there. But it's obviously a vast amount of machinery is in place because of the large number of advices that are done. And that's very necessary. But I'm going to talk about more of the nuts and bolts of what a statistician should be doing as part of that process when working in the pharma industry. So, as already been said, I've been around for ages and was a regulator at the MHRA for a long time, but then in a more European setting was chair of Biostats Working Party and an alternate member of SORB. But nationally, I led the MHRA Scientific Advice Review Committee. I also was involved in setting up parallel scientific advice process between MHRA and NICE, and was involved in some of the joint HTA and SORB discussions on development plans as well. So I'm glad that one of my favorite words, estimans, has already been referred to, and the importance of it not being a statistical topic. So obviously we do have a clinician in the room, at least one, and hopefully maybe a few others either online or in the room as well. And obviously it is a joint exercise. That's the whole point of it. And unfortunately, because we use this very mathematical word, people think that it isn't a joint exercise. And so that's maybe just one of the problems with the terminology. But it was great to see Tommy reference James Bell's paper, which is detailed clinical objectives, which sounds like it's a clinical thing. But obviously you have to understand the clinical thing before you can do anything else. And so it's a joint exercise. But anyway, this is a reference to a UK TV program. But anyway, if you like that sort of thing, you can make nice words, or nearly a word, out of estimand. I know it's 2 words, but give me a bit of license. Again, it's a good segue, the previous presentation, because are you a statistician, or, as a member of Novartis told me last year at a meeting, they considered themselves to be a drug developer. Now, obviously, if you go into your local cafe at home and say that you're a drug developer, they might ask where your lab coat is. But I do consider myself to be a drug developer, and I hope that many of you do as well. because you're not just a statistician, as it were. You have a broader part to play in this whole process. So many years ago, people got things by post, and you stuck it into pigeonholes. So some people might remember that. But if you're too young for that sort of thing, you might think about what I'm talking about today, about avoiding working in silos. And this happens all the time. And I was in a meeting last week where a statistician said, well, I said, well, what about X? And they said, well, that's not my job. And again, if an assessor on the other side looks at the stats questions, but doesn't look at the clinical questions, if that's how an applicant has decided to divide the advice up, then they're missing a trick. And on the other side, if you don't do the same and not fully involved in the process, you're missing a trick as well. So speak up if you see something that you can help with. And I know it's very scary speaking up, but it's worth it. Okay, so give it a go. And I'll be a long way away if it goes wrong, I suppose. But for that point of view, that might be telling you something about your organization rather than you. If you do it in the right way, of course, it's very important that you do it in the right way. Okay. So this is a team game. Yeah, this is not an individual exercise. If somebody brings you in and says, I've got one question about the multiplicity strategy, or I've got a question about the estimation method, and we're going to do a pattern mixture model. And you start asking them questions, and they say, no, you don't need to know any questions. I just need your input because you're the expert in that. The smiles in the room for people online. And so maybe that does happen to some people in this room. And it's very difficult for you to do that in isolation. Yeah, because you don't fully understand what the development program is. And you don't understand what the detailed clinical objective is. Because maybe your comment is, this isn't the right trial to do at all. And so it's irrelevant, all of this stuff at the end, because when it goes to EMA, and the SORP advice will say, this is dreadful. And it doesn't matter what the answer to the complex statistical question is at the end, because that's irrelevant. So have to know what the bigger picture is. So we saw a very lengthy explanation of an estimation method, I suppose, and talking a little bit about the estimand in the previous presentation, which is important to be part of the briefing book, but you need to sort of come up with a snappier question. That's important. So, and be precise when you're doing it. Obviously, it was highlighted that you shouldn't ask a question that you don't want to know the answer to. And you should also, if you ask a very vague question, which is this development plan okay? The answer is, well, it might be. Yeah, you see, and that's obviously going to happen. So you need to be precise in your questions. And then the other thing I remember reviewing these things is you'd say, oh, we've been really lucky. We've been appointed as one of the RAPs for this procedure, and there's 37 questions. And we've got quite a few things up on this week, but we've got to do that as well. And I've just told you now that you've got to look at all 37, because even though only 3 of them are dubbed to be statistical, I think you should be looking at all of them. So I'm not your favorite person anymore, but obviously from the company's point of view, I don't think it's ever necessary to ask that many questions. I know we're talking about complex and large development plans, but you need to focus on the main things that you're really struggling with and need regulatory buy-in for what you're planning to do. Just to clarify what I mean on the second bullet point here about minor and major, what's minor and major might differ between the regulators and the company. Yeah, I'm not saying that they're right or wrong, it's just a different perspective. The impact from a company's point of view of one of the very minor things from a regulatory point of view might be a massive difference in the cost of the study. And vice versa, other things that are, so are very minor from a company point of view might be very major from a regulatory point of view. And so they'll spend a lot of time answering that part of the question because it's very important to them. When in fact, you didn't really mind. You could have done it A, B, or C different ways, and which they will then tell you in the answer. But that doesn't matter to you, really. You would be quite happy with any of those solutions. So it's sort of be careful and be concise. Now, so there are other routes. When you're getting into more speculative approaches, the latest statistical method that's just been published, or maybe even worse than that, in this modern world, obviously it isn't even published. Someone's just put it on archive, and then someone's write a blog post about it. But that doesn't mean that it's actually correct. It hasn't been scientifically reviewed, and there are lots of issues there which obviously regulators will rightly highlight. But the way to sort of find out what regulatory opinion might be about such things is to chat to them informally at conferences and things of that nature to try and understand where they're coming from, rather than try and putting it in writing, because it will probably be lost in translation in some way or form. I think it's better to focus on the main issues. I mean, if you've got some exciting new method that you want to propose for a tertiary endpoint, maybe there's no need to ask that in scientific advice, because it's not. The whole dossier is not going to fall over if the regulator doesn't accept that. So you can put that in and see what happens. Probably. It's not, why waste time on it in this forum? So it's big ticket items, I think, are important. Now, we're back to silo culture again. So hands up if you're a HTA statistician. Okay, so we've got a few, and hands up if you're a project statistician or study statistician, whatever you want to call that. So there might be some overlap. There was at least one overlap who considered themselves to be both, and then lots of people didn't consider yourself either, so you're something else, which is fine. But my point here is that silo is a problem, or can be a problem. And it may become a problem in this new world that's being created with these joint clinical assessments in the HTA world. And so when I think there's going to be a need for statisticians who primarily was focusing on submission work, and statisticians who primarily focused on the HTA work, to come closer together. How that's achieved is going to be a major piece of machinery within large pharma companies, if that's necessary, if the two processes come closer and closer together in time. And how we organize our workforce is going to be complicated. So that's more of a strategic point rather than anything else related to scientific advice. But the purpose of the joint scientific advice process between HTAs and the regulators obviously was trying to achieve, seeing what could these clinical studies serve both purposes, i.e. get a regulatory approval and also get HTA approval. And it was a lengthy process to go through to explore that, but sometimes it was worthwhile, I think, because you ended up knowing what you hadn't got in your design so far and what you would need going forward to get HTA approval, or whether, in fact, they were more relaxed. It can also highlight the subgroup problem in terms of what HTAs might require and how you're going to investigate that. Okay, so you've done all that work, produced the briefing book. It's been scrubbed to within an inch of its life. Everything's been checked, double checked, triple checked. Had 85 meetings about it. Regulators don't know that we do that, but that is in fact, it's been checked so many times. They read it, find a spelling mistake on page 2, or they find something I read, question 2. What does the FDA think of writing to CHMP? So there's these sort of things can get through because these briefing books are massive, but I know that they are checked by many colleagues within the companies to make sure that sort of elementary mistake doesn't get to them, and it's important. But now, after all of that's happened, and then the assessment process happens, we get the answers. And you might get a call from someone and say, "Oh, they've given us the advice. We've got a problem on question 7. We've got to change the plan because they think this." And if that happens to you, you say, "Send me the full advice. I'll read it and I'll get back to you." Form your own opinion. Very, very important. They'll say, no, we've got to decide today. I know that, but anyway, but try and be patient and try and explain to them that if we rush at this stage, the wheels will start to fall off. So don't do that. It's my advice. Again, difficult to take my advice or put it into force, but I think it's worthwhile. Okay. Now, why on earth I put up The Curious Incidents of the Dog in the Nighttime? Well, it's a great book and a great play if you're ever lucky enough to see it. And it shows the value of diversity in teams. In this case, the importance of someone with autism, and has a lovely way of solving the Monty Hall problem in pictures rather than mathematical equations. And so some people can visualize things like that and produce a solution to a problem like that beautifully. But that's not my point. That was an aside that people are supposed to put in presentations nowadays to allow you to refocus, and then we'll come back in the room. So the incident, the reason I put that picture up is that it's based on a Sherlock Holmes novel, essentially, in terms of who did it and, as it were, and what was going on. And it's about something that didn't happen. Okay, so what people do when they get the results from the scientific advice is they didn't say this, rather than they did say this. Okay, so then once they say, well, they didn't comment on that, so we're in the clear. The party poppers go off and everyone's happy. They didn't criticize this aspect. But maybe you didn't actually ask them about that, which is a bit of a problem. You see, and you thought that they would just tell you voluntarily, after you'd asked them all these questions, they would answer another one that you didn't ask. Then they're not going to do that. Obviously, they do have a duty and will point out major flaws, but there are limits to that. And what's a major flaw if that you didn't highlight everything to them in the first place? So how are they supposed to know that? So be careful about this and make sure that, in fact, you ask the right questions in the first place. Because if you don't, you're setting yourself up to fail later. And I've seen in the old days of scientific advice face-to-face where companies would come up with questions 1 to 3 and they would present them And then they would say, and obviously the regulatory response would be, we don't like that development plan. And they said, we thought you'd say that. And slide 4 would be another development plan. You say, so now that isn't allowed anymore, which is good, but equally not moving to a development plan that you think is one that they are going to like straight away does seem a strange approach. And so you have to be realistic in these things. So, and again, you read and read this advice. What does it mean? And sometimes you make it fit what you want to see. Okay, so that's another problem that I've seen. So if you've got multiple people reading the advice, that's very important, and very important to have those discussions in a team level to make sure you've got a consistent understanding of what it means. Yeah, we're talking about very complex issues here across multiple studies. It's very important to do that and spend the time doing that. Okay, then for some crazy reason, you've asked questions to lots of different regulatory authorities around the world, and they've all come up with different advice. So, first thing, don't panic, okay? Because in my experience, sometimes they haven't really given different advice at all. Because for some reason, you ask them slightly different questions, because and so that can be one of the problems. And so then it seems like the answers are different, which of course they would be, because they've had different questions, but the actual overall advice is quite consistent. But of course, there are situations where, yes, they do want different things. And you have to get used to that. That's why you ask them the question in the first place. So, and then what's the solution? And then that is one of the art of being a statistician, is to come up with some solutions in that case that can meet both of the, if it's just if it's for Europe and the US, that's what you do. And then obviously we'll also have other considerations for the rest of the world, including China and Japan. But can you fulfill all of those development needs for this worldwide development? And then, of course, that might mean that you will not follow the advice of one of the authorities, and will be a sort of strategic thing that a company has to do. That's life, as it were. It's not, you can't please all the people all the time. So and you have to then be professional and do what you can. So now, so just to wrap up in terms of what I'd like to say today. So I know, because I was there for a long time, regulators has a very hard job. Yeah, so the last thing they want is if you make their job even harder. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. Be fully upfront and transparent with them, and they'll be as helpful as they can. Yeah, they'll still be helpful if you're not upfront as transparent most of the time, but you can understand why they might get a bit fed up with you and not be quite so helpful. Yeah, because they're professional and good people, but they're not. There's a limit. Yeah, so don't push them too far. Okay. I think the Esteman framework, or if you prefer, if it's helpful when talking to your clinical colleagues, detailed clinical objectives, is a way of getting us involved more broadly in the development process. Yeah, it was my great pleasure to see hundreds of development plans over the 16 years I was a regulator, and to comment on them and to try and improve them where I could. On the other side, it's crucial that you use your skills as broadly as you can, and don't restrict yourself to just commenting on something you might be the worldwide expert in, but you're actually a very good expert more broadly than that. and you're probably the best person in the GPT, or whatever you call it in your company, to comment on those development plans. So make yourself visible and get a seat at the table. It will do your career a lot of good, and you'll be making a real difference to patients. So the working on the, I suppose I've focused on the clinical project team, but I realize now there's also a regulatory affairs component to this as well, which is important too. They will have their own style about how they like to do things as well. And so it's broader than just the clinical project team, but work together with all of the teams when you're producing the advice questions in the briefing book. Yeah, I might be preaching to the converted, I hope I am, but that's a very important thing to do. As I said, don't panic when you get different advices, scrutinize it carefully, make sure that you fully understand all the different advices, and then come up with the key differences and then a plan for how you're going to solve them. Yeah, you can then turn it into more of a mathematical problem if that's how your mind works, and then you can come up with solutions and different options that you can present to the big teams that are going to make massive decisions for, you know, huge risks to companies in some cases, and also in terms of massive amounts of money that need to be spent on these developments. So you'll become popular by helping people make better decisions by doing that. And then you will be, you know, fully embracing the value of the stats community in the broader pharma development, which is crucial. Okay, so I think that's all I have to say. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. So I think if we have the last speaker, online, so we can start before with the discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for great presentations from the two perspectives, so the regulatory side and the industry side. Although I think actually David's was kind of a mix of presentations, and I think it's great to see both the system, but also get some more, as Antero mentioned, grassroots feeling on how it actually happens. So yeah, the speakers are here. Any reflections, questions from the audience? Yes, Khadija. I think we can throw this around as well.
Speakers for a great presentation. I have made some observation over the years about the absence of statisticians during scientific advice and interaction with regulators. And this is an issue that makes the benefit from that scientific advice questionable, especially if the questions that are being posed by the company are actually mainly statistically driven. And I'm just wondering, in the industry setting, what are the steps that are being taken to try and address that issue, which I think we have raised previously? That's my first question. Second question is about also understanding the limits of a scientific advice. For example, as quite rightly been highlighted by the first speaker about, you know, coming early at the design stage rather than after you've completed your study and then wanting the feedback. Often also what we get is the data, and we are asked during the scientific advice to comment on the data, which is something that we would normally do as part of an assessment process. And again, what are the steps that the industry is taking to ensure that a clear understanding about the limits of scientific advice? So these are my questions. Thank you.
Thanks for great questions. Yeah, probably I'm going to put David on the spot for a first answer, but I can imagine there are also answers from the room because there's more than one industry here.
Yes, and thank you. So just to emphasize, obviously from a regulatory standpoint, obviously lots of efforts over the years, as you said, to when various scientific advices were taking place and statisticians weren't involved, then we, the MHRA and other places, encouraged statisticians to attend. And obviously that worked over the years, and so that became more common. But then from the industry side, I would say what I was saying is, yes, it's got us so far, as it were. And so then now if there's a lot of clinical questions and some of them are statistical, then in an industry setting, that's where they might focus their attention. But I think they should be focusing it more broadly, even though they're very, very busy statisticians, and they're saying, do this week and this, that. But I think in this very important time of the development, it's crucial that they're involved more broadly. To make that happen, it requires guts and determination from the statisticians involved in the companies if they think they're being sidelined in that silo way. And so I think it requires managers at high levels within companies to vocalize when they're upset, when their teams are not being fully integrated into the process.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe I'm supposed to lead the discussion. Want to add to this, Alexander?
I have another question.
There was another question.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Khadija had a second question.
Yeah,
so
but
I think,
of course, I think it's of course a question of let's say resources at regulators. You know, in my experience, I think you know, of course, the questions have become, let's say, more sophisticated and sort of integrated into clinical development, and this has, in my view, sort of led to a sort of, let's say, a greater integration of you know, statistically sort of oriented questions into and merging into clinical questions. So I think this estimate framework is something where definitely, you know, my background as a clinician, I'm completely dependent on statistical support still. I'm very early in the learning curve of sort of you know, using that framework in my thinking, and I think it has also sort of is reflected, for example, in our agency, where we have more statistical resource available and expertise available than used to be the case maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So I'm really sort of enjoying this sort of integrated, collaborative way of sort of thinking about the scientific advice procedures, for example, you know, together with a statistician who sort of understands the implications better than I do.
Yes, thank you. I hope it kind of addresses your questions, Khadija. I had a small chip in as background, so we very much start from clinical and integrated with clinical. The other direction I'm seeing happening, and I'm sure that's also happening in companies, the scope is broader. It moves to earlier development. If you think about around biosimilars, it's not only clinical anymore. And I think what needs fairly urgent attention is all the developments around artificial intelligence was already referred to. So I think the step is clinical, but I think a broader perspective is needed on both sides. So I would almost say the default is any scientific advisor is a statistician there from a company.
You started your presentation with talking about good advice is the goal. Can you explain a little bit what that is?
I think it's sort of a question maybe of, let's say, efficiency and a mutual target of let's say, trying to develop a scientifically sound and an efficient program. I think those are not exclusive. And our aim is not to make your life more complicated, certainly from a regulatory perspective. Our aim is, as I said, is to help you devise a program that meets regulatory expectations at the stage when your dossier is being assessed. So as I said, there is a, let's say, like a discontinuity because the scientific advice procedure is not binding on subsequent assessment. So there are two different things, but but still, I think it's a mutual goal. We are not trying to make your life more complicated, but we are trying to make it compliant, if you will.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a more technical question. How much time do you get allocated to read our questions, to read the briefing book, its appendices, and to formulate a response?
This is the problem of a civil servant. You are sort of, legally responsible for what you are doing. So I think this is, of course, a question of time management and prioritization. So the answer is you take as long as it is required to formulate a quality answer. But I can say that our agency at Fimea, we do maybe, I don't know, maybe in the range of 80 to 100 scientific advice procedures per year. And I think the SOAP sees, I don't know how many, probably that many a month. So you can sort of calculate from that. I think it's especially from my perspective, it must be especially sort of a, let's say, like resource intensive for statisticians who are not sort of, focused on one clinical specialty like clinical assessors are. So you are sort of have to think more broadly and be involved in more procedures than a clinical assessor might be. But I don't, probably our agency has a sort of record of my time allocation, but I don't have that at hand.
Me neither. But as I said, at Fimea, we do quite a lot of oncological procedures. I usually take a quick look and, I would say a typical oncological plan, 2 working days for first report. We also do a lot of biosimilars. I would say, okay, it looks very typical. 1 day, maybe a little bit more for the first report. Of course, if there's controversy, there might be more needed to wrap it up in a final advice letter, or actually the joint report, which is pretty much the last step where I'm involved.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I can just add, so hence that's the reason I was talking about the 27 questions or the 43 questions. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you've had a guide there for about how much time an individual assessor might spend, but others might spend less and others might spend a bit more. It depends, obviously. But that's, very ambitious target for 27 questions, as it were. So, especially so even if they might focus more thoroughly on a few of them. So be kind to them was my point.
Yeah, we can't take the risk that the prioritization of the questions actually happens at the regulatory side and not on yours. That's essentially what will happen.
Yes.
Can I go first? Sure. It's rather a quick comment because you made me raise my hand. I really like both presentations. And there's 2 messages that I specifically liked. One of those was in David's presentation, the slide with the title "Be Concise." That's really, really helpful. If you don't drown us in teeny tiny details, then we will be able to give a better answer, probably, to the key questions. And also, it will help us in giving consistent advice, which I think is very important to be fair to companies and to patients as well. And the other aspect is justification. Unfortunately, you're right that in a range of scientific advices, the justification is not enough to allow a good discussion. Then we have to go back to standard responses, which is probably not helpful as much as it could be if you provided the justifications. So overall, thank you for these great presentations. And I think the short answer to the question, how much time can we allocate? If there's too much detail, then probably not enough.
Yeah, thanks, Lucas, for the addition.
Yeah, thanks. I think these were really insightful presentations. I just wanted to follow up on one aspect, right? And David, you illustrated it brilliantly, right? I mean, at the moment when you get to scientific advice, there has been tremendous work at the company side, right? So basically a fully fleshed out development plan, very clear opinions all, so, you know, what is the right study or studies, right? So it's probably understandable that you will, on the company side, face internal resistance, right? If you get an advice which tells you, well, you know, do something totally different. And my question is a bit, you know, are there any ideas how this process could be made a bit more flexible, that you get a bit more early input without having such a level of detail? I know it's a high ask and I don't have the solution, but I think it's probably one of the challenges we face.
No, I can't answer that question directly, but I mean, I know when companies are thinking about 4 options, say, and then at some point, as you know, they go with one, and then they have to get approval for that one, and the other 3 are forgotten about in some senses, when they were pretty good proposals to get to that stage. And I don't know if there's a way for companies to be a little bit more open sometimes. Obviously, they don't want to do that because they've decided that this is the way forward. But I think it's a bit hard to push the regulators the other way around when they say, well, why didn't you, why have you proposed option 2? Well, you thought of option 2 as well. And it was a very close decision between option 1 and option 2. So you can't really blame them for suggesting it. So so if there can be, so I agree, more of a dialogue might help how strong their feelings were about option 2 versus option 1 that could get lost sometimes in the report they give.
Obviously, the procedure itself has a possibility for follow-up questions. So if you if you want to sort of take a second attempt, then that is possible within the procedure itself. But I think more often than not you see sort of the questions framed pretty let's say prescriptively. Does the agency agree? And so that's I'd say like maybe not the best possible question to initiate a discussion, as it were.
You almost took the words out of my mind. I really hate that type of question, to be honest, because that doesn't sound like scientific advice. That sounds like asking for buy-in. And I think just to give a brief, you actually also sketch asking scientific advice at a certain stage where the company is. And I don't think that it's impossible to come earlier and make the scientific advice actually part of the decision making. Which is, I think, essentially, the role of scientific advice, not to just agree what's proposed, but actually help you deciding in a final way. So I think there are options there. And actually, maybe among statisticians, we would agree a little bit earlier on options like that than the general broader team.
Yeah, I think my question goes exactly in this direction. Also, we learned our first session this morning, where it took 3 years. And obviously, that was my impression, more time spent on the side of the regulator to come than to the final study for the study design for the study. Would there not be an opportunity from the side of the regulator to get earlier agreement, especially in small populations, where it's already extremely hard to conduct those studies and not realistic to fulfill completely different requirements from the regulator? That's my flair for regular.
Thank you. I kind of feel obliged to take this one because both Benjamin and I were quite aware that we did not really answer the same question in the session this morning. And that's not because we don't recognize the need to come up with something here, but we also don't want to overpromise. Changing a process for interacting with regulatory authorities with our respective responsibilities is not an easy go. But one of the ideas that at least is kind of starting is along the lines you're proposing. are there exceptional circumstances? There have been with COVID-19, but more generally, are there exceptional circumstances where we could at least try and experiment with a different way of engagement? And we are open for the discussion, but I really don't want to overpromise anything, because we are in a regulatory compliance and decision-making setting where we have to tread carefully.
Also, exactly referring to what was just mentioned before.
Yeah.
Maybe also on us to open the door for maybe options which may make it easier, then also to find agreement among the regulatory and regulatory.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. We got a hint that the third speaker is online, so I would love to, let's say, close the discussion and thank the speakers again, and we will probably have time for a second one.
So we can go with the last speaker. I don't know if it's Gergo is the correct pronounce. Okay, perfect. So we have the last one presentation. Just a quick presentation of our last speaker. Gergo is trained as an health economist and currently acts as a co-chair of the subgroup on joint scientific consultation. Gergo is the head of department at the National Institute of Public Health and the Pharmacy Department of Health Technology Assessment. He supervised a team of medical and economic professionals who prepared the critical assessment of manufacturers submit the reimbursement application of health technologies. And the last, but not less important, I think the most challenging task is father of 1 year old. Thank you. The floor is yours, dear.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you should be around the globe. It's a pleasure to meet you, and it's a true honor to be present at your event. I'm here to talk on behalf of the HTA Joint Scientific Consultation subgroup, and a little bit less about the 1 year old that we're having right now at home, but it poses like different kinds of challenges as you might envisage. So we are at a really interesting time of our lives here, should I put it this way, because the consortium that was responsible for delivering those deliverables that will feed into the joint European HTA process is about to close its operations. So by the end of this weekend, our contract will expire, and we can surely say that the promises made by the UNITA 21 consortium were fulfilled. We have still some deliverables that are coming out from GSCs. We have a revised external guidance, briefing document template, timelines and published. These carry on. These are being published with rather minor revisions compared to the last versions that we've had published throughout 2021 and 2022. We are right now in the phase of a handover procedure to the Commission and the HTA coordination group. So at this very moment, both the European Commission and both the HTA consultation group, HTA coordination group and the appropriate subgroups are looking at the deliverables made by UNITA 21 to see if those are fit for their purposes, to make sure that everybody gets up to speed. In the meantime, in the HTA coordination group, we did establish throughout this year the GSC subgroup, and we are setting up right now our internal processes to liaise with other subgroups as well. This comes from the text of the regulation, as well as with the current practices that we have and should have. we are creating a work plan and mapping the already existing capacities for joint scientific consultations, and we are sort of entering an interim period until the 12th of January 2025 when the HTA regulation comes into force. So just a brief overview of what JSCs are and why are they important. Basically, JSCs are scientific advice exercises, so they should start before the start of the pivotal trials. They are intended to be provided for health technology developers, and they cover aspects of health technology assessment, meaning that we cover clinical aspects as well as economic aspects too. This may contribute to post-launch evidence generation, as well as for advice on pivotal clinical trials too. The aim is just to create the optimal and robust evidence necessary for HTA bodies to have the necessary amount of information when that product enters the market, and to make sure that it's usable for HTA bodies all over in Europe, as well as for the health technology developer too. All of our discussions are structured around the PICO framework, so patients interventions comparison and outcome, and we also assess questions related to health economics as well. That might, for the last update that we're having on the deliverables that I just mentioned previously, this is going to be a whole separate section, a whole separate appendix to the briefing book that is issued by the HTA bodies. So until so far, we have expected under UNETA 2021 6 to 8 JSCs. 7 were actually conducted, 3 in the first round, 4 in the second round, and you may see the breakdown of these numbers on the slide right now. You may observe that there might be a slight overrepresentation of the orphan designation and even first-in-class designations. I would say that this is rather not surprising in light of the pharmaceutical product development pathways that we are observing right now. We have been applying the selection criteria of the HTA regulation, and that is something that is envisaged for the interim period as well. Overall, there was from the 13 consortium member, 11 partners of the UNETA 21 Community for Scientific Consistency and Quality were involved in JSCs, and the roles of the assessors and co-assessors were taken on by a total of 6 different agencies. 6 different agencies. Among that 6 different agencies, there were old member states, new member states as well, so there was a broad selection, I would say. We did involve patient experts and clinical experts throughout these JSCs. And the final round of public consultations has just ended for the working methods of JSCs in July 2023. We have successfully approved the updated guidance and templates and briefing book within the consortium executive board just last week, and they are expected to be shared throughout these days. All of the current versions of the JSC documents are accessible openly, so you may want to check on that. I know that we are sitting at an EFSPI Congress, but we should mention medical devices briefly. Unfortunately, no JSCs on medical devices were conducted under UNETA 21. Under GA3, there was 1 pilot early dialogue on MDs, so that's the kind of that's not that advantageous. The experiences are a bit limited in this field until so far. What we are doing right now is we are trying to translate all the methods and guidances that we have into a so-called roles and responsibility matrix, which was asked by the heads of agencies group and developed by the UNETA 21 GSC Secretariat to help the implementation of the HTA regulation, help to figure out the processes that might take place under the HTA within the HTA CG. I would like to share some details on the interim period, which is lying ahead of us right now. So in the meantime, while the HTA, CG, and the subgroup for joint scientific consultation is examining the UNETA 2021 deliverables for uptake, we wanted to get an overall picture of how the subgroup members within the joint scientific consultation subgroup view their experience in conducting scientific advice. It seems right now that there are more members who have experience with joint scientific consultations than those who have experience with national processes. Just to give you a really plain out in the open example, that's the case for my home country as well. Actually, we engaged in much more joint scientific consultations than with national level consultations, but that's obviously related to the size of the market, or could be related to the size of the market. We are right now setting up the within and between group of procedures, and we are expecting an implementing act in the second quarter of 2024. Now, these implementing acts have been addressed yesterday partially by discussions following the presentation of our colleague David McConnell. These implementing acts are intended to provide more detailed regulation on how GSCs or other topics as well affected by implemented acts may work under the HTA regulation. These implementing acts will undergo a consultation. So it's the part of the comitology procedure that these implementing acts will undergo a consultation. The question is what gets into the implementing act and what stays out of it. Also, what is important in this interim period is that we realize that we have to sort of maintain our capacities available for joint scientific consultations, and we also want to exercise ourselves in terms of joint scientific consultations, and decided to go for voluntary advice of HTA bodies in the interim period. Now, a call was posted first towards HTA bodies to indicate their willingness in taking part in parallel EMA HTA scientific advice for the interim period that was closed on the 2nd of June. And also HTA bodies had to indicate how many consultations they wish to take part in. Basically, we had the opportunity of participating only as an observer. So whoever is not that experienced or feel less confident about their role, they are free to observe and join in for these procedures. And as we are sort of in an interim period, we had to rely on national rules and procedures to avoid conflict of interest situations and maintain confidentiality. So these are staying in national responsibility, and will not be managed centrally. But the observer status also needs to be made sure that observers don't have any conflicting interests and they maintain confidentiality too. The whole framework of the voluntary advice is started by consulting European HTA bodies for being consulted for expressions of interest. It's really dependent on how much resources does an HTA body have for these voluntary consultations or voluntary advice. We will apply the HTA regulation selection criteria. And there's also sort of a rule of thumb that if 2 active HTA bodies per procedure are willing to participate in these voluntary advice exercises, these can be seen as joint efforts on behalf of the joint scientific subgroup. If this minimum number is not achieved, if this minimum number doesn't fit, this means that it's going to be a national process, a fully national process. And the request will itself continue as an email-only scientific advice. Basically, the output is, I think it's going to be the email advice letter and individual recommendation letters. of the participating HTA bodies. There will be no consolidation between the positions of each HTA body, but joint e-meetings will be organized to help common understanding and exchange of the opinions of HTA bodies. There has been an official announcement posted in July 2023 in both the HTA bodies and email web pages. The coordination is carried out. The coordination is carried out by GBA. GBA is going to be the HTA body coordination contact. Applicants are invited to flag their interest for parallel scientific advice for EMA as well. We are expecting an effort similar to those that HTA bodies may have in their national constitution processes, where they have such procedure and some joint meetings that are going to happen throughout these procedures. As the interim period is not so long, so there isn't actually so much time until the 12th of January 2025. We expect around 3 procedures in total for the interim period. So this is really, this is really just to keep the lights, just to keep the lights up. Okay, so possible synergies with the legislation that is about to change in the upcoming years when it comes to regulatory questions. We have identified 2 possible synergies so far, but of course there are obviously more than that. One of them is assessing or looking at unmet medical need. As you may or may not know, the legislative proposal of the European Commission proposes granting additional market exclusivity conditional upon that the medicinal product addresses unmet medical need. There is some sort of there may be questions around how do you define unmet medical need. It seems right now that the EMA may be able to set scientific guidelines for the application of the relevant article and initiate a consultation process with both HTA bodies, payers, and other stakeholders as well. This might be an interesting thing to touch upon, and as far as I can remember, the issue of unmet medical need was covered by EFSPI's comments on UNETA 21 deliverables as well. Another thing which might be up for interest is having more alignment with EMA timelines. This was asked by EFSPI as well in the comments and by other institutions too. The legislative proposal envisages shortening EMA scientific assessment timelines, so meeting these expectations and more engagement with HTDs and also more alignment with EMA timelines is going to be a bit challenging or difficult for HTA bodies right now, but this is still in the negotiation phase. So the section's title is how to get the most out of scientific advice, and I'm in an interesting position because the UNETA 21 consortium still exists. The interim advice period has sort of started until 2025, and I'm also sitting at the HTA-CG, and I'm also co-chairing the GSCCG. So this question could be answered in a number of ways. So I would try to be as precise or as reasonable as possible. So in the interim period, try to be responsive to advice. So that would be my best advice. So if somebody has applied for an advice and received advice, it's really good to have that advice implemented to the clinical development program, the design of the clinical trial, or even into your health economic models. My second advice in the interim period is get used to sharing more information. It is the health technology developers' responsibility of sharing information that is sufficient for answering the questions that are proposed by health technology developers. Somebody proposed discussing unmet medical needs in more details. We thought about this and concluded that it might not be a priority for HTA bodies. Neither are extensive discussions around systematic literature reviews or network meta-analysis. They are interesting, but the design of the pivotal trial and the methods how the data collected in those clinical trials being evaluated are maybe a bit more interesting to HTA bodies. Another practical advice that I can come up with is follow up on updates of the HTA stakeholder network. I know that the EFSPI is a member of the stakeholder network pool, and some consultations are going to follow in that pool. So you might want to engage in those discussions and follow the updates of the HTA stakeholder network. You may want to engage in voluntary consultations, but that's of course it's in the remit of the health technology developer. So if you have the opportunity to engage in one, feel free to do so. We're more than happy. We're also excited and happy for this new system that lies ahead of us. Beyond 2025, so after the interim period, up until that point, you still want to, or you might want to engage with the European Commission's consultation procedure on the implementing act on GSC. So that's, as I've said, that's going to occur in the second quarter of 2024. And following up on the implementation rolling plan is always a good idea to see the draft timelines when some opportunity to comment might come your way. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention and finish my intervention. I'm happy to receive questions and I wish to answer if I'm able to. Thank you.
Thanks, Gergo, for your presentation. I think we have 30 minutes for our discussion here, and also if we have some question online.
Yes, please, and thanks again, Gergo. Totally different phase. So we've discussed already a little. Should be on. Yeah. We've discussed scientific advices on the EMA side, where there's lots of experience, and here we are actually starting to build experience. So I will maybe, in terms of the discussion, your presentation, maybe open the floor first for questions, responses to Gergo's presentation on the joint scientific advice. Any
question here? So thanks a lot for the overview. So just before you joined, we heard how SORP scientific advice. I mean, that's in the order of hundreds per year. I think one thing that a lot of health technology developers are a little bit concerned about is also the capacity for joint scientific consultations. I mean, we saw the numbers here for the interim period. It doesn't look like a lot. So any considerations from your end on the capacity for doing these joint scientific consultations, which will be, I mean, super important also with the big aspirations that are baked into the EU HTA legislation?
Thank you very much. I don't know you by name, but that's an excellent observation. Yes, we are also having not I wouldn't say concerns, but we are also seeing this issue of capacity. But it's not just in the framework of GSCs; it's also in the framework of GCAs and all kinds of joint work that lies ahead of us. We have to approach this issue in a number of ways. One of the ways is having voluntary advice in the interim period and getting others up to speed. So as I've also touched upon this issue, first right now we are carrying out a mapping exercise to see how experienced these agencies or delegates are that are there in the HTA in the subgroup for joint scientific consultations. So this is the first step, to get an overall picture of how big is your experience so far and what is your capacity until so far. We are also we are developing this voluntary advice scheme for the interim advice. That is to have as much people on board as possible to scale up our capacities. Now, this is in the best interest of older member states. This is in the best interest of new member states, former UNITEL members, current UNITEL members, everyone. So the idea is to get everybody up to speed and see our internal capacities that are available. And the third one I wanted to mention, and that was addressed during yesterday's talks as well. So right now there are at least 3 different initiatives that are aimed to carry out capacity development, not in the context of GSCs, but also in GCAs and other and joint work in general as well. So that would be the EU for Health initiative. By the as part of the EU for Health initiative, there is a call for, or there should be a call for HTA bodies on behalf of the European Commission. There's also Sustain HTA, which was awarded a grant under Horizon Europe. And the third one would be the technical support instrument that the member states might want to use to build up capacities. So yes, this is a question that always rises in the context of all joint work, and it's an excellent question. We have to keep this on the agenda item, and we do see this problem, and we are trying to address it.
Great, thanks a lot for the answer. The floor is open for broad discussion, questions, both related to this, but also, yeah, I see hand raised there. Probably it's good to have the original speakers there as well, because the floor is open for discussion. Also on Thursday, please, yeah.
So yeah, I'm Cornelia Dunga-Balder from Novartis, and I'm wondering if preparing for voluntary advice or for a GSC. So obviously what we have is the development plan, what's planned regarding our trials, and for the regulators, of course, would we then also include any plans what could be included, which could potentially be of use for HTAs? Or what could we provide in addition to what we would provide for regulators?
I think that's a question for you, Gergo, and I hope you followed it. Could you, yeah.
Yes, I will try to add some. Yeah, I will try to add something to that. First of all, thank you very much. That's the second question that always rises when it comes to joint scientific consultations, apart from capacities. So, what is needed on behalf of the HTA bodies? Well, that's usually the aim of scientific consultations, to figure out what is needed by HTA bodies. What I would propose, or I would suggest as a starting point for the discussion, is that we are developing or delivering our procedural documentation, and it's available online. The final and thirdly revised version is going to be already available online. That can be a good starting point in terms of procedural questions. What is needed for HTA on top of regulators? Now, what we may also observe in terms of more technical or more professional questions. So when it comes to comparators, choosing outcomes, etc., that's an interesting question, because we may see that over time there seems to be more alignment when it comes to choosing the right PICO for your assessments. But there's also what we're observing right now is that we have new member states on board who might not have been the part of the UNETA joint actions or the UNETA 21 consortium. So that can be that can affect alignment as well. But that's something that can be highly specific to one joint scientific consultation to another. I'm not sure if I can provide a more exact response than that. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, and appreciate it, giving also the phase where the developments are.
A brief follow-up question. you mentioned comparators, so obviously, yeah, it would be useful to have a proposal what kind of comparators are planned. Yeah, another question: are any clinical practice elements are these also of interest?
I would approach this comment or question from a broader perspective. So, sticking with comparators. There are two things that we have to mention here. So, one of them is that we have at UNETA 21 we developed a guidance for direct and indirect comparisons that can be used as a guidance document for figuring out the right comparator. Even for, I would say that I would even read it for GSCs. It would make sense. Another thing that would be worth mentioning right here is the scoping exercise that we are doing for GCA. So it's not for JSCs. That's true, but determining the scope of the assessment, that is something that you would definitely want to think about when you are being involved in JSCs as well. In the scoping exercise, what HTA bodies usually do is they do their own thinking of how a comparator should be chosen, but they also tend to reach out, and that's the case of our agency as well, that we also tend to reach out to clinicians asking what kind of comparator would be appropriate in our national setting. Of course, with respect to confidentiality issues as well. For clinician insights, so for joint scientific consultations, we regularly invite clinicians to comment. That's for the case of joint scientific consultations. So HTA bodies do team up and try to invite a European clinician if it is possible. If not, then we are referring to national clinicians too. The most important thing right here for including a clinician is conflicting interests, is the assessment of conflict of interest and being free of conflicting interests, if this is possible at all. So yes, we are very much open to bedside experience of clinicians and patients, most importantly as well, conditional on meeting the conflict of interest, conditional on being free of conflicting interests.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm going to shift gears a bit in the sense we also have Q&As online and make sure that they also get the attention. So.
Yes, the online audience is circling back to the two previous talks. How are the members chosen or elected to the Scientific Advice Working Party? And as a follow-up, despite the long list of names, are there advice requests that demand a specific expertise area which are not currently covered by the members? And what happens in such a case?
In terms of a Scientific Advice Working Party, that's by nomination by member states. So that's also how and it's a member and an alternate member, and the member is actually indeed nominated and needs to be approved by the CHMP. And that holds for more working parties and committees. That's the route. And in terms of expertise, that's actually that is a challenge. The idea is indeed that, of course, within the working party, the process of accepting certain scientific advices is connected to the expertise of the particular member, but also to the expertise existing in the national agency. So that will kind of determine which advices to accept and which not. It can sometimes, because we have lots and lots of different disease areas, sometimes a bit challenging on whether the expertise is there, but it also happens that there is external experts being consulted in the course of the process. But it's good to be aware it's a team effort. So the member actually falls back into, and I think Tommy explained that, fall back to a team that's at the local agency, and not only clinicians and statisticians, but there will also be PK experts, depending on the questions that are being raised.
Yeah, maybe also going back to the first two talks. So the topic of estimates was also mentioned, and there seems to be a sort of a dualism in the sense of, estimates. It should not only be for statisticians, as you rightfully said. On the other hand, like David also said, but I mean, it might also be, let's say, an angle to discuss exactly these clinical topics that should also be important also for statisticians. So I would like to hear a bit further reflections on this estimates. Is it now a good thing or a bad thing if you see it in terms of the advice procedures? And on top of that, maybe also in terms of if now for the estimates, usually the treatment policy is to be chosen, and how far is there then still a discussion?
One, two. Okay, so first of all, I think it's very good still. I mean, we seem to be having challenges to make estimate framework a common playground, as I probably said earlier. But I think it's still necessary to have this framework, and the world would not be a better place without it. So I think I wasn't there when this concept came to our attention, really. But I think, in my understanding, it started from missing data. And then we started realizing that, okay, there's many other things beyond missing data. So I think it's kind of learning process that has to take place. I think we are, as statisticians, quite far, but we need to make sure that there is education taking place so that we can really share this idea and language and the concept and everything, the content eventually, with clinical colleagues, and of course beyond clinical questions also related to beyond that. I hope that was a good start to the answer, so someone else can continue.
It would actually be great to have a clinician view.
Well, I already alluded to the fact that statisticians are more advanced, probably on average, than clinicians are on this field. But as I also said, I don't think there's any way back to a previous world where this framework was not discussed. And I think translating it into these detailed clinical objectives is an important way forward. I think there's a further learning curve that needs to take place at some point. How do we translate the estimate framework into SMPCs and ultimately, real world clinicians, how they can appreciate what is targeted with these estimates, and how they should interpret various estimates in their sort of clinical work. So I think that's sort of something that also needs to be addressed at some point, but it's a gradual work. I think I'm sure good progress is being made on that front.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a sort of an advert for the EFSPI FPIA Estimans Implementation Working Group, which I'm a member of, and there are members in the audience. And so there's various subgroups of that group that are working on the very things that you alluded to, and indeed things that also just been mentioned. And that is not just statisticians on the group. We do have clinicians on that group as well. And so progress is being made to socialize. I didn't think I'd ever use such words as that, but to socialize the use of estimans more broadly, and the implications that it has within companies. If you think of protocol templates, and for example, so what's ICHM 11 going to look like, and that is one area that might help when it's in that guidance document as well. It'll become more commonplace. So there are a whole broad range of areas where we appreciate more needs to be done, but we're not giving up. So we're here to stay.
Yeah, thanks a lot all. I see you writing down, but maybe take another online. I'm kind of leaving it up to you, which is the most interesting one to share.
So a bit a longer one, and it's about getting two different advisors on a primary estimand, staying with the topic. How, for example, how do we account for an important intercurrent event? And sponsors get different feedbacks from FDA on the primary estimand. Can you give some advice on how we shall handle this? And shall we plan, or is it an option to actually consider two primary estimands, one from FDA, or one for FDA and one for EMA? I think you tackled a bit during your presentation already on that.
I did, but I mean, so that problem is not new with estimands. Obviously, that even if you think of two different analyses, that was or two different endpoints, or it's whatever it happened to be, that is not new. But so what you do is the same as you did before, as it were, as obviously you look into the power onto both analyses and maybe power the study, so you can achieve both of those aims for the different regions. It gets into a very contentious area about, do you need different SAPs, do you need and things of that nature, but most of those can be overcome, and regulators sort of, most of them at least, think that their world is the world that they are responsible for looking after, rather than the whole world. You see, and if so, then that allows such things like that to happen.
I can only confirm that we do see protocols or analysis plans, well, actually both, of course, together when it comes to primary analysis, where for different regions, different estimands are used, and any detail can be different in the estimand, or any attribute. All of them can be different, and I think it's acceptable. It's not ideal, of course, from company perspective, but sometimes, yeah, they can really, well, sometimes there's no big harm being done in this way.
Okay, thanks. Yep.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
So this is one more question for Gergo, actually, Anders Kors Rasmussen, Novo Nordisk. But just reflecting back, last year we had at this very same conference also Andrew Scheel talking about how winter is coming, and also how to approach these JSCs. I think a lot of HTDs are also looking towards these as a bit of a lifeline in terms of getting more predictability for the JCA. And there were, I think, two things that stuck with me from Andrew's presentation. And the first one was ask about the PICOs at the JSC. And the second is that don't approach this as you would approach a regulatory interaction, because it's non-binding. So go in and ask the right kind of questions. So I don't know, do you have any kind of similar reflections, or sort of one-line piece of advice also for HDDs that are looking towards JSCs as a potential lifeline here?
Come on, like you're making me compete with Anya in terms of let's say, like, presentation skills. Like, that's just impossible. So yes, so no, I wouldn't want to do that, because I would definitely fail. That's true. I think what Anya said still holds. So look at PICOs, ask the questions that you wish, and the third one, maybe I would just elaborate. Okay, so ask the questions that you wish, just straight up ahead, but provide the necessary information. So don't expect us to figure out your thoughts. So we cannot read minds, unfortunately. That's still, and it's not going to be in an implementing act. Okay, So so we cannot read minds, provide the necessary information for us to get our insights and ask the questions. On the PICO exercises, just to be a bit more precise, health technology assessment bodies carried out a PICO exercise or a so-called scoping exercise without health technology developer submission in the past couple of weeks and months, and the results of that exercise is going to be published today, if I know correctly. So follow up on the unit website to see how HTA bodies are managing finding a common European PICO for themselves. That might be indicative for GSCs, but jumping on what Anya said, provide us with the necessary information that makes us enables us to pose our or to show our positions. And thank you very much. That was an excellent question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah.
To actually add something to the previous question about the two different estimates, because it fits well with that example that Tommy had chosen, that I think what the companies can also do to avoid to get the feedback, the different feedback from different health authorities, is exactly to explain the why, right? That you increase your likelihood of getting consistent feedback if you have given us a good sound rationale for the estimate that you have chosen, and written it up well. And not maybe necessarily in the way that in Tommy's example it was written, where we have to guess that why was this the target, right? And this way you may increase your likelihood of getting consistent feedback because you have done kind of the groundwork well. So this is just something I wanted to say, that if the regulators need to be doing a bit of a guesswork, and because we unfortunately do not have the mechanism to go back to you to ask clarifying questions while we are looking at the briefing package. I would so often want to do that, but that mechanism doesn't exist. So yeah, basically a good briefing package increases your likelihood to get consistent feedback, actually.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that's great feedback. And actually, there's already lots and lots of time and attention to making briefing books, but we kind of give the message we miss the why in those extensive briefing books, and that would be hugely helpful. Maybe I can turn the discussion a little bit around, because I'm kind of noticing that we have shared how regulators look at scientific advice and give advices. David actually had a within company perspective, what could you do? But maybe also the other way around. Lots of people here do lots of scientific advices. Is there something that the regulators are doing where you think, well, maybe that could change or improve? Change is not a...
Yeah, if I may, I found it always difficult if I read scientific advice, or the same as when I get reviews from papers, that reviewers do not distinguish clearly whether this is really a no-go or whether it's just a kind suggestion to do something different. Yeah, and I had it once that FDA was luckily live, that had a clever idea, and then we asked, well, we don't want to do this because often said, oh no, do as you like. It was just one idea of us which you could consider. Yeah, and I think that would help us, especially if the procedure is written, that you clearly say this is major and this is just one idea of mine, take it or leave it.
So yeah, just to add that I agree with you, and obviously it's the subtleties of language, which is well, so every word matters. As I say, that the industry will be hanging on every single word that's in that advice, and then if it says may or should or could or all of these things, which then in different languages as well translate slightly differently as well, so it makes it even more complicated. And so I appreciate that. I mean, obviously the advices are written in English. That's just the facts, as it were, and so it has to be commonly understandable. I had a discussion a long time ago about the word maintenance, which meant a different thing in 4 different languages about what it actually meant. And so we were all arguing, but when we understood what we were talking about, we all agreed. There was nothing to write in the advice. So, but it was all about that one word. So again, I haven't got a solution to that because of the complexities of language, but sometimes there can be misunderstandings along those lines.
Yeah, I would only add that I think scientific advice is a mixture of clear guidance based on a guideline that this would not fly, this is not acceptable, you need more than that, something like that. And then on the other side of the scale or spectrum, we have some enthusiastic people like scientists with scientific background who might sometimes get excited and propose their own ideas. So that may not be great from your perspective, but hey, we are all human beings, so that also happens. So I think there's the whole spectrum, and I agree with David that it comes down to taking the best out of it, and language is maybe important, but I'm not sure we can optimize it beyond some extent.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead.
If I may add, sometimes the vague language might be due to the fact that there's no clear-cut recommendation we can give because we are lacking the justification. So we are again in a situation where we can only do guesswork, what is meant and what was the reason for a specific proposal. And then we can try to say, well, if this was the reason, maybe that's not a good idea to pursue. But if another reason was the background of your suggestion, then it might be a worthwhile approach to do so. It's sometimes also not clear whether we really strongly recommend, as we would say, or whether it's just a suggestion and you could follow this approach. So sometimes it's also, then again, due to the lack of direct exchange in some procedures, it's sometimes hard to understand what was the reason and how can we best advise. So we try to give you a more or less of an holistic view, and we try to tell you what in different situations might be a good way forward. But I agree that sometimes it's not optimal on both sides, to be honest.
Yeah, over there, Helene.
I could also add maybe one more aspect to the same thing. I think the case is usually what Benjamin explained, but sometimes it is also that, like Antero said, that you really kind of also want to make your life easier at the marketing authorization stage. So we might give you this kind of the applicant may consider, because if you do this, you get a broader label, but we can't really write that like exactly like that, right? So sometimes those are really also hints of that your life is easier and you get more with this when you file, if you do it like this, but it is a scientific proposal to you and you don't have to follow it, because you can also do a smaller study that has less evidence, but then you have more trouble, but it's not a black and white no-go, right? So then you just have the hurdles at the later stage, right? And maybe with the HTA bodies, you will have the hurdles. So that's why we propose you to reconsider, right? But it's not that at the CTA stage, we will say that the study cannot be conducted, right? So it is often really scientific advice, right? And in science, things are not black and white. But I think it is a big downside in the European system that we have so little meetings, right? Because those things would be much more easy to communicate verbally in a discussion, where you can have an exchange than in writing. And that is an unfortunate caveat in our system.
Thanks, Alina. And I think that's the caveat we discussed, and we might improve over time there. Yeah.
Hi. How can we solve that caveat? Is there open discussions? I know I'm asking a silly question, but if I'm hearing today 3 or 4 people in the regulatory system about this, can we start a conversation? I used to work in the agency, in the Swiss agency, in the EMA, and I can fully relate to not having enough information provided to you on what is being written. And now that I'm working in industry, I also understand that teams have been working on it for a couple of years maybe, and find it common sense, things that are maybe not written, and that's why they're not written. So maybe an invitation to the industry colleagues here to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who has never heard about your program and write that document in the way that that person can understand it. And I know I'm at the risk of stating the obvious, but I think that mindset and putting yourself in the other shoes may also help.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. It kind of also aligns of possibly engaging earlier, and when you've reached the stage that you're kind of married to the program that you've thought about. And maybe, but also there I would highlight another thing that at least comes to my mind, just to respond back. Sometimes I think that's certainly among the statisticians or the methodologists, both sides of the table actually know exactly where the big controversies are. And some, let's say, negative opinions or maybe not such a good idea do not necessarily come as a total surprise. And it would probably be helpful if we are a little bit more open on that up front, that we are actually clear on both sides, that we know where the tricky points are, because I think that's essentially the case, and certainly in the more extreme parts. So I think also to your question, a little bit more open, a little bit more earlier would probably benefit both.
And just to add to that, maybe from an industry perspective, I have some experience where I've been brought in from the outside, so I'm not in the project team. And so then I read the proposal and I don't know some things because I'm not on the project. So I ask those sort of questions and ask for some of those revisions to be made. So I think if that can be done within companies more broadly, because that offers some sort of learning opportunities from one project to another as well, in terms of what are other people trying in their scientific advices. And this is obviously talking in large company sense, but I think that would improve things within large companies as well, and hopefully improve the briefing book that is sent in.
Great idea.
Thanks, Tom. I could use that as closing phrase, because if I look at the clock, it's exactly 1:30. So really, thanks a lot for both the questions, discussions, and suggestions. Also online.
Thank you and goodbye.